Shinji and Warhammer40k. Chapter 25. Timeskip Troubles. Part 2.
Timeskip! All is well! Move along! Shinji stared oddly at the passing steamed peanut seller, who had yelled out for no particular reason. The journey through China proved enlightening, exciting, and in many ways just damn confusing. It was the very first time he'd ever been out of the country, and there was so much he found himself at a loss to understand. He took in a deep breath. Indeed, everything felt different. Older, sadder, more solid in the mainland. Those jagged mountains, the roof of the world, seemed to anchor reality itself. A true learning experience just to get to them. He had to exhaust his pitiful bag of artful persuasive tricks and had to learn new ones. His travelling companion, native to the region, had proved amazingly useless on that end. Not that it was out of malice or incompetence. She was perhaps in her middle-30s, but had a rather plain face that resisted the influence of years. The Buddhist nun who introduced herself as Hasya had a nervous reaction to practically everything in the sinful and barbaric outside world, and more specifically the men who barely had any control over their natures. It didn't help that she was also a powerful psychic, and having lived for so long in a serene mountain retreat, every spike of negative emotion was magnified by her unfamiliarity with it. It was a true miracle she'd ever managed to get from Tibet all the way down to Japan. There were a lot of people with muddled memories along the way. But finally, the mountains. The journey to Javaal was almost at an end. The locals of the sleepy mountain town gave the two new travellers no notice. They recognised the women as one of those people from that monastery somewhere over there that no one really had any particular interest in finding out where exactly. She had the frightened, twitchy mouse demeanour, already familiar to them. Her companion, a boy, had a severe facial twitch, probably mentally damaged, the poor soul. That was what the mercy of Buddha was for.
We are close, Sir Tavia,
said Hasya.
It should be no more than a few days' ride by donkey from here. I started off with one of the monastery's faithful animals, but poor little storm cloud. The world is so harsh and uncaring. Such is the way that all things, innocent or not, be subject to suffering.
Shinji slapped at his face to get it back under control. I thought you sold the donkey before heading into the lowlands. That wise beastie was likely the sole reason its owner even managed to survive getting through the mountains. There were very little people to brain shock between the valleys.
For his loyalty, Sir Tavia, I sold him away for mere pieces of paper and metal. I am unclean. I have repaid good works with evil, thus proving against the innate sinful state of all existence.
Her words were mournful and meant truly. It was one more in the pile of personal failures that added up to her continued distress. And to maintain a strict vegan diet, she'd even less qualm in brain-shocking people that tried to cheat the ignorant religious mountain bumpkin. Hey, you two! If you're not going to buy anything, don't stand in the way of my There was no flash of light, no crackling sound. Shinji sighed. In many ways it was really very impressive, since there was barely a tingle even on his own senses. After having been hooked up to an Evangelion, overestimation made his perception of such things incredibly keen. It was something that completely failed to impress Asuka, as in other things utterly useless in normal life, and as a superpower. How many minutes of his life did the hapless sweet potato merchant lose? He tried to repair those disturbed memories, while his guide looked contrite.
Once again, I have strayed from the path. I beg your forgiveness, Sir Tavia.
I'm beginning to understand why that 8-spoked karmic reel you have on your robe looks too much like the symbol of chaos, Shinji muttered below hearing. No harm done. At least, not much. A little louder. Just please, relax. We're almost there.
I will reply when we have time. For now we must find you other transport. It is not good for you in your condition to have to climb these edges.
She nodded and went off briskly, and rather bravely all considering. She also had the deep wisdom of one who had devoted her entire life to the pursuit of inner peace. She was hardly any wispy teenage girl to be squeamish about the facts of life, and the order of her life was dedicated to times of work and prayer, both to be considered holy. She knew much about the practicalities of travel, from the food to eat, what to wear, the roads to take. It was just that her information was at least 80 years out of date. Shinji followed, still slightly limping. He used the walking staff, a naturally gnarled length of wood, instead of the well-made titanium cane in his pack. The first protection against robbers on the road was to look as if they had nothing worth robbing. With the longer reach of his support, he could do an almost half run. He reached and tugged at a flap of her yellow robe. The sidekick thrust splashed harmlessly against the surety of his identity. She had a heart full of peace and a mind at a hair trigger. There were bound to have been even more powerful and persuasive minds in that city monastery, even if they would have been more noticeable. Perhaps even 30 years could have rolled their patience. "We have time, Hasya-san." The ancient truck that had brought them thus far was still in town. The driver and his son were still waiting for the whole haggling process to be complete for the next load, and had extended an open invite for their well-paying passengers to join them at the local inn.
"But Sir Tavia, the great enemy of our kind approaches with every day."
"Yes, but as you said, finding Javaal is all but impossible. To guilt me with the mere possibility that my slight delay would cause others to die is to give me too much responsibility for chaos? Unknowable random events." His grip was weak and shaking. "Remember, just recently, why I'm the one who needs to do the negotiating?" She gasped.
"In my haste to ensure your comfort, I have only added to it. Oh, I am ashamed."
She bowed her head. Ugh. He had to keep her from kowtowing right there on the street. Shinji Ikari thought himself a rather self-sufficient sort. However, he'd never really considered making a cross-country trip on his own, much less 3 countries, even granting the hundreds, if not thousands, of befuddled people left behind. It was bad enough with those who knew him personally, that someone who could cling to the razor's edge of necessity and get through it despite sheer everyday terror would be so servile in his presence was just too much. "Comic real," he had to remind himself, "that's all. The fact that I'm going off into a cult of psychers aside. Game Workshop just ganked whatever they found cool at the moment. It's just a coincidence. That's all. It has to be." There was a place, hidden and mystical, similar to yet unlike the fabled Shangri-La. It was a place of warmth amidst peaks of snow, learning and tranquility among dark crevices of fear and superstition. It was one of the few remaining secrets in the world, invisible even to the electronic eyes passing overhead. Rumours of its existence were few and given little importance. It was real and unreal. It was a monastery in a secluded valley. It was more or less self-sufficient, with its own tiny village with separate retreats for monks and nuns. The adherents of its sect were said to have strange, miraculous powers, but didn't attach any significance to these abilities. In other words, it was much like any other of the places forgotten by time. No one could find it, probably because it was already abandoned so long ago. Why even bother to look? In Javaal, those old stories were real. There behind its walls were minds that made those gathered by the PKRU seem like babies. Javaal hid from the world, needed nothing from the world, and yet knew almost always what was important about the world. There was nothing to see in the valleys, but those within could look up and behold the glowing lines crisscrossing the sky. The disciples of Javaal had a natural dislike for prophecies, but Mahayana Buddhism did posit the possibility of there being multiple Buddhas. They knew that the world would readily abuse those who had abilities they didn't understand. It was for that reason, nearly 900 years before, many mystics gathered from all over Asia to form a place where they could be truly safe. The war against the angels, however, brought home that no one and no place was safe. The peace and passiveness they had clung to for so many years would no longer protect them. Only might, only violence, and only a protector could save the few remaining fragments of humanity's ancient and heroic past. Wise were the chief priests of Javaal. They knew that the most likely response of any hero so chosen would be, "No fucking way." So as traditional, plead, bribe, and when all else fails, threaten. "I really need to meet those old men," Shinji mused, "so I can decide if I should bow in respect or give them a boot to the head." One consistent fear he had was of being out-manipulated, since he was too mindful of his mere 15 years, and until just then had never left home farther than a few hundred kilometres away. It was just that a reliable precognitive and a supercomputer were a frighteningly efficient partnership that had managed to escape the PKRU's practical initiatives. At the same time, however, he longed for the event, as how else was he supposed to really learn?
"Once more I apologize for my people. If we were not truly desperate, we would not have even thought of resorting to this."
"No, it's all right, Hasya-san. I don't know why I can't synchronize with the Evangelion anymore, but if somehow it's me that's fault, well, the chance that they could fix it is worth the trouble." He grinned slightly. I suppose wealth really isn't important to their values, as given the exaggeratedly casual way they propose to disturb the flow of wealth for the globe, just the second off would be catastrophic. There are many different ways of acquiring wealth with a minimum of fuss, such stock markets and leeching a mere 1% of every cent out of every transaction a hacker could trace, but to him such didn't represent real money. It was dependent upon a global economy that could collapse at any moment, and the international network remaining uncompromised. Hence, under his fingernail on a map, drillers would always find oil, which was still a precious resource even with just 1 billion or so people left on the world. He had his initial capital, appropriately enough, from futures. Now he more or less owned the banks that let the stock markets function, fleets of merchant ships, heavy industries, things that could, with only slight pressure, be diverted into other, essential pursuits. He frowned. Wealth, personally, didn't concern him either. It was a ministered fund, not his precisely, just serving the overall humanistic goals. He was going to hold off on calling it a war fund or an imperial reserve unless there was absolutely no choice. In his was on firm ground, with the controlling interest actually the magi. It was really all the machine's capitalistic magic, nothing like an unemotional, ambitionless trader which had no need of sleep to really work the system. It had insulated his assets well. Which, when everything goes to hell suddenly for no reason, would make it so glaring that it would still be there and functioning well. People would notice. People would start to dig. He might need to use a thermonuclear device or two. He shook his head sadly. How do I convince these people that going all imperatus is the real worst-case scenario possible? Ah! His thoughts were shaken loose as he himself was shaken loose from his saddle. He had a brief moment of frustration at his own citified ways before he hit the pebbly ground flat on his back. Fortunately, his thick coat absorbed most of the impact, but it was enough to knock the wind out of his lungs.
Satava!
Hasya shouted, concerned.
Are you hurt? Are you dead?
If I was, how am I supposed to answer? He stared up at the sky, so infinitely high and crystal clear. He heard stomping from above his head and gravel flying across his vision. He sighed again. Well, I have a feeling that if someone asks me, were there lots of ass-kicking in your journey, I have no choice but to answer, yes, there was.
I apologize for this poor donkey. Oh, Satava, please.
Did I really used to apologize like that all the time? Ugh, how annoying. Damn karma. Slowly he got back up to his feet. The donkey looked entirely too smugged. See that pattern on the cloth over there? See the 8 spokes on that reel? Don't kill the dumb animal. He forced himself to remain calm. The Adeptus's mount seems a much more sedate beast. This animal would not be a great loss, remarked the farseer. It's a true horse, not this insult given only to fit your height and youth. In all the natural sounds of the farthest lands, it was the voices in his own skull that were the loudest. He could understand how the cliffs and shadows brought out in the people such terrifying pragmatism against the multitude of imaginary and not quite so imaginary horrors. You just want to press up against her body, he accused. You have been around classical beauties and manufactured allure, and those girls who you still refuse to consider beyond the status quo. However, despite her sheltered upbringing, she has admitted to having been married before. She is no blushing maiden, and understands well how cold these winds are. She has her own unique charm, and you must admit her body is live and shaped well under those folds. Shinji's hand found the rock, and it took likewise great self-control to keep him from bashing his own skull. She's old enough to be my mother. So? That just means a fruit fully ripe and sweet. The cliffs echoed with his primal scream. We need to get to Javaal quickly, Shinji ground out as he got up. I really need to learn of your people's mental techniques. Hasya nodded.
It is not too far away anymore, Satava.
Every place we go to, every time of the day. Anyone likely to cross our path? Why aren't you guys helping to keep her under control? No justice to met out, Commander. Nothing to smash.
There are no plots to unravel, bright lord.
Shinji felt a shark-toothed smile.
Simply, we are bored, and you are the best entertainment we have found so far.
Shinji picked up his walking stick and tapped at a rock. "Donkey! Come here!" The beast, recognising perhaps merciless intent, approached warily and let the boy mount it again. "You know, I've read about the Buddha's early life," he said without looking back, as soon as he'd secured himself and got the donkey moving again. "From the moment of his birth, he seemed to have been hailed as destined to be either an enlightened one or a world conqueror. The way I see it, though what he did later on was great, he was never really given a choice but to be great. That seems unfair. It was like what the people needed at the time was granted to them. Strangely enough, Buddhism was its own form of strict atheism in that it denied the gods.
It was the way of those times, Satava, and we have no right to impose our own limited understanding to what had already happened."
But he did conquer the world, I'm thinking. He conquered more land and got the allegiance of more people than Alexander was ever able to. Shinji was frowning. Like Yang, I distrust the great man theory of history, but wars and warriors come and go. To really cause untold suffering, a system of defined ethics is unmatched. Or to cure it, of course. Much more good is done in the simple lives of man by such words.
"I see you are starting to gather kernels of enlightenment, Satava."
"No, I'm merely at my limit. Please, stop calling me that. I'm not cut out to be any real leader. I just want to get my synchronization working again." Shinji shot back. "I know that a bodhisattva is someone who's to become a Buddha, but I'm hardly in any way shaping up to be one. I'm going to remain pretty much worldly, I think."
"First, Satava, I refer to you as merely one who will be."
She paused.
"Actually, that is not the meaning of it at all. I just like to pretend it is. It is easy to say."
"Could you just call me by my name, please?" She winced. She turned and her eyes were unfocused. Her voice echoed.
"No! She must maintain the implied pun!"
She clutched at her head.
"It has happened again?"
"It's a really bad pun anyway, Hazi-san. It's bad enough that I fight angels. Do I really need that connotation?"
"What?"
The psychic nun blinked and looked vaguely affronted.
"You know I do not remember these flashes from beyond. I have no control over them."
She sighed and looked away.
"It is as the abbot had said of me, a pool of talents, but lacking depth."
"Except for your automatic tendency to zap people," Shinji did not say. At least the damage wasn't permanent. It was already weighing heavily on the woman's soul, and she had a deep enough guilt complex already. As an example of the control they could teach, Hassia was really not inspiring much confidence in Shinji Ikari about the monks of Javaal. That a secondary personality was devoted primarily to a single talent, paratime contextual revelation, was a promising start, fractious as it may be. How long before that damn monastery? Someone who had set out from Tibet intending to walk to Japan if necessary had a very unreliable definition of far. There was much kicking of ass. Meanwhile, back at Tokyo 3, the discussion of what to do was underway. There had to be visible justice, but at the same time an open trial would drag NERV's many illicit practices out in the open and damage the credibility of the world's only effective defence against the angels. The UN was already presented with the expansion of the facility known as the Earth's Cradle, originally a cryogenic storage facility to protect the genetic diversity of the human race, and egos of those people who considered themselves essential to the task of rebuilding the world from total catastrophe. The Grand Canyon as active defence, out of NERV's performance against Ramiel, was stymied by continued vagueness as to the power output necessary to breach an AT field. In the end, the proposal was relocated to the central United States, which at least had an Evangelion to test with. This left Europe with literally no defence.
"We cannot afford any loss in NERV's credibility, not if we want to continue to have free reign in rebuilding NERV Germany,"
was the gist of the communique from the UN Security Council.
"The general population of Europe, looking at what happened to China, is undecided as to whether being helpless is as much of a gamble as being a target in the first place."
"Motherfucker!"
Misato had shouted.
"So he is going to get away with it!"
"It's hard to find administrative punishment for Gendo Ikari," Futsuki admitted, and not because he held any personal bias for or against the NERV commander. "He lives like an aesthetic. We can't punish him by taking away privileges, since he enjoys so little in the first place. That only leaves
physical punishment."
Misato growled.
Take away his freedom, his expectations not to be subject to random pain.
We can't put him in prison, Misato, Kaji advised. Shinji carries the Evangelion, but Gendo carries the authority of NERV. It's the whole demeanor. Inflexibility, ruthless but persevering against all things. That defines the face of NERV, too.
Politics!
She spat.
Oh, he will be punished. He's going to regret everything he's done, you can be sure of that.
Kaji grinned. He was relaying the UN's official word on the subject.
As long as no direct physical damage is done.
Gendo Ikari was torturing himself just fine. He wasn't the type to moan or pace his cell. He just lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Were it not that he got up when they brought his meals, the guards would have thought he was dead. It wasn't helping against any stupid rumours he was a vampire. He'd be freed of his cell eventually. He'd have to make a report to Seal. It was perhaps cold comfort that only they, lying and devious bastards all, would be the only ones who'd really believe him. It was the brutal simplicity of it that floored Gendo Ikari. The fulcrum was his first loss of control all those months ago, at the Ava cages and in full view of the command staff. Then, the structured media blitz to popularise the boy. The machinery of it. It was timed so precisely that if it was not a faction within SEAL, then an even finer secret still to escape their notice. Simplicity, again, in that for a long time whatever science had come up, he and SEAL simply attributed to each other. That implied some idea of their relationship, which was in itself a great breach of security. Who knew? Who could have provided that information? Futsuki, Akagi. He frowned. Ryuji, certainly. He could consider that man already fully compromised by, well, everyone. The spy was, as far as the intelligence community was concerned, a man-slut. So the question becomes, what benefit would any of these factors gain from working for the boy and his backers? For the boy did have backers, it was only a matter of placing him on the structure. So, the obvious system of threats and rewards were already in place. That left only one obvious answer as to why they should prefer another master. The destruction of the one they were currently under. Him and/or SEAL. He frowned. No, he wouldn't die. Not until he could be sure he would be with you. Since medieval times, the soul had searched for its truest expression, damning itself and others in its way. He said to himself, have humanity at last found a way to kill the soul, and thus remove the constant object of God and the devil's wrangling?
This is Javaal,
Hassia said, smiling. Shinji nodded. He looked left, he looked right. Then he looked up at the sky. He sent out his senses to the fullest. He took a deep breath. There's nothing here! The woman's cheer increased.
Exactly so. That proves it is still here.
The boy relented. The Enclave was thoroughly Orphic in that respect. There had to be a pithy rationale there somewhere about how everything was an illusion anyway. He'd gone so far without any real proof, as Hassia's affirmations were in themselves not sufficient. Even casting some of it into doubt, but nonetheless continued on the road anyway. It was faith by any other name. So, he came knowing there was ever a chance there was nothing at the end of this journey. And now, he hoped that his companion was simply not deranged, or that it was all some overcomplicated kidnapping plot. How do I get in? Hassia put a finger to her lips and considered the three cliff faces of the dead-end box canyon they'd found themselves in. She pointed to the far left.
That one.
Shinji stared doubtfully at the solid rock face. However, any society of mentalists capable of hiding itself from other mentalists for nearly 1,000 years had to be good at maintaining such illusions. So he just walk in to get to Javaal? The woman from Javaal nodded.
Technically, we are already in Javaal. It is a region of our influence, not a specific settlement.
She stared at the rock wall and set her horse at a slight canter.
Better a slight one, actually. It helps if we close our eyes, too. The old masters were very thorough. It believes it actually warps space so that it seems solid to most perceptions.
Shinji nodded again, slowly. He pulled on the reins to get his donkey moving. Here we go, then, he shouted with a slight chuckle. To Javaal! The donkey, a stubborn but prideful beast, hearing the exuberance of its rider, sped up to a trot. It made a snort as it passed the more demure pace of the horse. Shinji closed his eyes and closed off his senses. Illusions that had the veneer of reality could be very dangerous. Bam! Donkey and rider all but flattened themselves against the cliff face. Fortunately, their velocity could only really be considered as middlingly slow. Shinji fell off the saddle, face up again. His ride bellowed in incredulous indignation. What the hell? Its snorts all but said. What compels me to do that? Humans are morons! I hope you enjoy my horse voice. I won't be doing it ever again. After a short while, Shinji heard slow clop-clops and saw Hasya's head peering down at him from the top of his vision.
Satava?
Shinji said nothing.
Javaal really is here. My senses are drawn to it as a compass is attuned to the poles. It is just that now I am within his area of influence.
Still the boy said nothing. His eyes weren't even accusing.
It's the first time I've been out in 30 years. Then there was all these strange things I had to go through. It was all so confusing. Don't blame me. All these damn rocks look the same to me.
He began to laugh. That only discomforted the woman even more, thinking he was doubting her.
I am not a charlatan,
she attested further, her voice tinged with hurt. Slowly, Shinji got up and felt his face. He'd opened a few of the scabs, but other than that he felt fine. Okay, I'm not going to give up that easily. He wasn't immune to embarrassment, but it was much easier when there were only 2 people to know within 10 square kilometres. There are only 3 cliff faces here. I already eliminated one as the entrance. So, Hasya-san, where do we try again? Hesitantly, she pointed to the one opposite, the right and slightly concave cliffs. The donkey snorted and edged away from Shinji, refusing to let him back up. Bucephalus, you're not, the boy muttered. He led it by the rein to the far wall. Hasya and her horse decided to test the entrance, and it was not so much as she just disappeared, as that he had extreme difficulty remembering where she went all of a sudden. Half of her and the horse poked out from the rock wall, and clarity returned. He walked in behind her. It was a natural tunnel, with cliffs forming a high arch. It was dark, lit only by a single thread of sunlight trailing down from the thin gap above, and the brightness of the far end. It took them perhaps 15 minutes to get to it, and beyond was an open and sun-drenched valley. He smelt the earthy scent of green growth. He felt the brush of warm air. He watched wide-eyed at the scene, so pastoral and clean. The people there stopped their tasks and just watched, not with any fear or suspicion, but honest curiosity. He felt peace, utter peace. And from the far end of the valley, a high monastery cut into the very mountain, he felt the thrumming of many minds in harmony.
Javaal!
Hasya breathed. He understood now why she was so quick to persecute herself. Every time she made a compromise with the world, she destroyed the deep serenity that her home seemed to impart. Even the loss of the smallest piece was tragic. He felt so small and unclean. He had come, not to partake of that peace, but with clear intention of destroying that utterly. He was still unshaken from that intent. He saw old men in yellow robes approach with faces set into grim masks. They knew that too, and of how there was no hope in convincing him otherwise. It took some more time to really be allowed in, and he was treated with an indifferent sort of welcome. He followed deeper into the valley, past villages and rice terraces, to the monastery. It was much larger on the inside than without. 900 years of make-work tunnelling made it so. There was a central meeting hall, where most of the laity could gather to perform the necessary rituals that sustained their society. Despite the strongly aesthetic virtues of the valley, Shinji supposed a little sense of grandeur was not undesirable. The place was not a backwards, superstition-laden community, even with its religious core. He knew a little bit about the extensions of Saiso electricity, and as such was not struck numb by the apparent magic of crystals apparently lit by the force of faith in an enlightened mind. Crisscrossing the chamber, set carefully from the roof to the walls in lines and patterns, made sure that it was always bright with a cool, clean light within. It was a look, he actually had to admit, that was very high-techy, as advanced future artists preferred. There were other items and measures he could discern that fulfilled purposes that in the outside world were done by complicated electronics. In Javaal it was done by a crystal or polished piece of rock, some wire, maybe feathers for decoration, and force of will. He nodded to himself. It was hardly any backwater. In the brief tour he saw that they had radio, several computers perhaps years out of date, but more than sufficient for the tasks at hand, and complete sets of many encyclopedias. These were not a people that eschewed ignorance. Javaal's greatest feat was not that it had remained so secret for so long, but that it had managed to remain so while consciously working not to remain isolated. It was the last refuge of the extremely rare results of the genetic lottery, who remained lucid enough to see that there was little choice than to bury their gifts, not always so easy, to try and live out a normal life, or to embrace that. There is actually a worldwide but highly unlikely community that was able to regulate this, looking for the abused and those that abused their gifts. For those who feared being a freak, Javaal was the mythical place of safety. Shinji looked at the council of abbots. Though predominantly Tibetan, there were also several... He wondered if the term foreigners still applied. Once within Javaal, they had to abandon all discriminations on race and creed. There remained still gender and the unique aptitude differences, but then again it was supposed to be a monastic retreat, and those seemed to be slight, more of tradition than anything else. There was one of them, a rather strongly built black man, who stared grimly down at him. Shinji puzzled over why the German word for shank cropped up in his mind.
"The boy is too old to begin training," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, badassery well established. His name, Shinji found out later, translated to the oddly appropriate warrior.
"That is only because most of the early practices require an open and uninformed mind. We built their ethics alongside self-control," replied another old monk, a long white beard, distinctly kung fu master-like. The peace lama tugged at his finely maintained whiskers. "Tradition dictates that, as it would take too long for a mind already aged and shaped with prejudice to catch up."
"Tradition is tradition. Or to be respected, it is not law."
This was said by the chief abbot, a man so old he'd shrunk, and there wasn't a part of him not covered by wrinkles.
"I have a feeling this would not be a problem with this one."
"There are reasons for our misgivings," the warrior lama from earlier continued. "As the boy must return to the outside world eventually, we have no guarantee that he will not abuse the teachings we give."
"Ah, but I believe we actually do have one," mentioned the reason lama, a tall and reedy man with a monocle. "Don't we, child?" Shinji was starting to feel really uncomfortable, but couldn't really pinpoint a reason. "Yes, I will not misuse what you teach me, but please do not doubt that if it can be used offensively, I will do it when necessary." The chief abbot laughed.
"Enlightened one or world conqueror, who among us here had not faced that choice?"
Only he seemed to be amused by that prospect. In the end, however, it was just a formality. He who seeks must learn. He who learned has sought. Prior to joining the school, we had to take the equivalent of an entrance exam. He was a little upset about that, since there was a slight chance that Hasia's journey to Japan and back would be made a waste of time and effort. A very small chance, since they wouldn't have gone through all that if he had a modicum of talent. There were the various disciplines: outward, telekinesis, and inward, telepathy, precognition, and physical tests. His scores ranged from acceptable to abysmal.
"For some reason, I expected more,"
Lama Shining Pagnor Warrior of Truth pointed out as he walked beside the chief abbot. All names were in the end descriptive, and those in Javaal no longer pretended otherwise, usually having public, private, and mystic names.
You expected something more impressive, yes? Almost a god in human form?"
The wizened old monk chuckled, himself Curly Krishna the Sunshine Kid, while tapping his walking stick upon the tiles.
"It is unwise for us to expect that, considering ours is a humanistic trust. Prophecies we distrust, the silly things."
"But the boy is just too... Will he really be strong enough in the end?"
"Judging by his youth, do you?" Like him, I am frail. Like him, I use a stick.
The chief abbot began to whack away at his student's right ankle.
Think then that I am weak?
No one of them, elder. But you are. You. That stick used to be the handle of a broom. For all his girth and power and skill in the martial arts, never had the warrior monk had faced such a thorough thrashing. Not again would he go there.
Where is the maybe bodhisattva, maybe hegemon most likely bored out of his wits now,
I believe he is with Peaceman facing past.
Ah, damn good am I at naming things.
Really not going there.
There are other ancient writings, child. Zeal had taken it upon themselves to rule. In the cities and in the plains they had exercised their tyrant urges, and sought goals of distinction, and grown sick of the pain of living. We are the heirs of Enkidu. Here in the mountains where the laughter and the little ones who grasp our thumbs form our greatest glory.
Shinji raised his hand. Question.
Yes, child.
Philological and theological conflict?
None. A system of morality requires only the consent of man, not the will of the gods, and we are more concerned with the application than publishing of papers for study.
Wow, you people really are atheistic, the boy breathed out. Other than the saint analogies of the larger real?
Still, it is this. People have always needed symbols. Must we then mock humanity because of this? It is a vessel we pilot, to bring a greater number of people to their true destination.
Shinji nodded. I am a stranger to this place, and soon enough I must leave. Am I expected to convert?
Ha! The old monk laughed. This is Javaal. Forcing someone to accept another moral code has never worked well. That is also why it's called an anti-intellectual system. Enlightenment comes from within, and it is your decision, child. Besides, I have a feeling the celibacy of the true path will not be to your liking. Surely not, pitifully limited monkey. Never! I will burn anyone that tries to get my young king to accept such a singular path.
Why are you so hung up about this?
It is almost wired into us that every Eldar must strengthen the race. There are no Eldar in this world. The closest I have is you, and therefore it is your lineage that must prosper.
There was absolutely no sign that the Javaali monk had heard it. Shinji coughed. So you know of Seal, since Master?
Teacher of any language is sufficient. I am sure you have noticed that I can speak and understand any language spoken. This is because I listen with my heart and not my ears. You will learn this too.
He stroked at his beard again.
And yes, we know of Seal. They placed their roots in medieval times in slightly similar fashion to ours. They wanted to preserve useful witches, but their roots go further than that.
What do you mean, teacher?
I am speaking in a literal truth, in that we are heirs of Enkidu. They are a pessimistic group who find their end truth in the fulfillment of their godhood inside dead scrolls. They follow the path of defiance and domination in the shadow of raging Gilgamesh. Hence the woman through whom Adam eats of the tree of knowledge and becomes conscious of being naked is looked upon as an evil tempter, entailing the loss of the primeval life of bliss in a gorgeous paradise. So the Seal seek to end man's pain. We hold a living point of view that is optimistic. The change to civilized life, involving the wearing of clothes and the eating of food that is cultivated, is looked upon as an advance. Hence the woman who brought naked Enkidu out of the wilderness is viewed as the medium of raising man to a higher level. The world is enough, even sinful and full of suffering as it is.
That's surprising. How does that affect the status of Bhikkhu and Bhikkhunu?
Jafar was based upon the notion of social equality from its very first moment. We still hold to certain traditions, intended by the Buddha to protect the less numerous female orders, but these rules have never been unalterable. At the very least, you will find that we have a co-educational system.
The old monk nodded.
I do not think you will find it too dissimilar to your outside learnings.
He would find it was indeed not, much again to the boy's discomfort. From there they moved on to the physical education course. There was a specific open-air area for such things. Temple martial arts was originally made to keep the monks from their tendency to become fat and lazy from sitting and meditating all day. Being able to punch someone's kidney out the other side was just a side effect, which to their surprise led to more initiates. It also helped discipline in the knowing that old age and guile could always defeat youth and enthusiasm. It remained much the same way in Javaal.
Yes, I know the logic of training, serenity, tolerance, and harmony for the use of crushing, slashing, stabbing objects seems counterintuitive, but it does work. For the life of me, it's strange, but it does work.
He rubbed at his kung fu chin again, amid the boy's bland stare. The old man's eyes twinkled with humour. There was a clatter at his feet. Shinji picked up what looked like half of a jumping rope set. There was a wooden stick, chiselled with grip notches, and a long string of some form of threaded crystal. Interestingly, he could loop it several times without breaking. There was some creative craftsmanship there.
I see you found one of the training rods given to the advanced class.
Everything crystallised then, all the oddness at the edge of his senses. The tests never end. Nothing corrupts like power can, and in Javaal they were at a constant watch over each other. Buddhas or conquerors, he flicked his wrist just so. Snap! Hiss! The string straightened out, a little more than a metre long. To keep it absolutely straight and rigid, air was compressed around it in a self-propagating yet sharply defined containment tube. That was what made the humming sound as he whipped it around. It weighed practically nothing at all. If he was careless, he might be able to put someone's eye out with it. He supposed with enough focus and practice he could get it to glow. He let the intent drift away. There was a sound as it deactivated. Shinji turned to the monk. The chief abbot has a video disc player, doesn't he? He asked, but not really needing the confirmation. Lama Peaceman coughed and looked away.
In our defense, we looked this way long before that silly movie came out.
He stopped stroking his beard and sighed.
This collective consciousness thing is sometimes really such a hassle. I would rather not lose my omnilinguality.
Although embarrassing enough, they couldn't do away with it, since the chief abbot tended to get even more creative. Shinji wondered if there was something in the collective consciousness that said, on second thought, let's not go to Javaal, 'tis a silly place. A good laugh had always been the best way to beat back the darkness. Everything's a test, Shinji thought as he sat in class days later. I can't stay here for years and years, so of course I have to learn everything at an accelerated pace. Which put him, with the equivalent of a mere 2 levels of learning, seating with the advanced class. He was a class dunce, an unfamiliar and unpleasant feeling. At the same time he was bored nearly out of his wits. Tricks and pretty lights, he wanted to shout. Why try to move mountains when you can move people? Of course a little part of him understood and said back, Are you insane? Do you really want these people to learn? And worse yet, attempt the practicals? For it was a silly place. Javaal was hardly a utopia. The valley could only support so many people after all, and in a closed system the only way that could increase was entropy. New people and new ideas added to it, while tradition tried to keep things steady without choking the life out of the community. Shinji hardly expected to be welcome, even if he was put into the class by order of the council. As he saw those eyes filled with wary indifference, he reaffirmed it didn't matter. He was there to learn and bargain for another unfolding agreement, not to make new friends. One thing was clear though, is that there were rude and self-important people everywhere. Somewhere there was a biggish shrimp that liked to push around other shrimps until it was caught and served in soup. And how the hell a mountain boy born and raised like Puso Winter Glory knew enough of shrimps and their proper colloquial usage to keep calling him Shrimp Boy, Shinji didn't precisely know. Live off him, snothead! His defender shouted and tried to give the much larger boy a shove. She didn't have much success, but the tormentor decided perhaps he had enough. Jam-yang mercy without restraint was one of those neat, responsible busybodies that every class inevitably had. Go on and be borderline and helpful elsewhere. As expected in any isolated group, there was an innate distrust to outsiders, especially those that appeared in the middle of the year. They had been told the outside world was sinful, decadent and corrupt. He was from the outside. It would actually have been better if he had been as coarse and bombastic. Instead, what they got was a frail, shy young man who practically sweated politeness. Don't mind him, said Jam Yang, fighting hard the urge to pat the younger teen on the head. It was strange. A part of her wanted to say, just stand up for yourself, while another wanted to make sure the newcomer was never troubled by anything. Huggle him to death, even.
He's not a bad person. He's smart too. Smart enough to know that while most of us are here to learn lessons, he is the lesson.
Shinji nodded, and so he tests the flexible limits of what he may or may not do. There were people like that.
I don't understand why he has to pick on you, though,
the teenage acolyte added.
You seem harmless enough for an outsider.
Because smart as he is, keen at the fighting arts, there's a part of him that's still dumb enough to realise you remain more alpha than he can ever be. At least the Farseer seemed to be thinking more decently more often. Probably because she was feeling content. Not pleased, just content. There was nothing like a village full of telepaths to make any illicit doings impossible. More likely, however, is that once again you seem to have gained the attention of most of the female population. Despite the best of intentions, Javaal was dull. The outsider in their class was so uninteresting that it was, in fact, interesting. His name directly translated to second son of a sailor, which was insipid enough that it might have been given by the chief abbot himself. Even if apparently boring and retiring, he was still their best direct source of outside world information.
Is it really true? Women outside expose their bodies, of their own free will, to the gaze of lecherous men?
He was asked.
Miniskirts? Bathing suits? Lingerie?
Yes, the opposite's also true after a fashion.
Do people outside really worship money?
There are some that do, but mostly I think they worship their own pride.
All those wars, all that death, it can't be real, can it? Why should anyone kill just for invisible lines in the dirt? For religions that say there should be peace? All these stories we've been told. Is it really that bad?
Shinji sighed. Not really. Before Impact, there was close to 6 billion people in the world that managed to live day after day. But every cruelty you've ever heard of, at some point, man had done it to another man, and perhaps worse yet. Humanity, it seems, made the term inhumanity only to describe its fear of itself. The problem was that Shinji Ikari spoke like that all the time. His abilities may have been just passable, but there was something in his voice that made the words in the encyclopedias seem so brutally real, and even subjects barely more gossip seemed like words out of a master, which made the actual teaching masters rather irate. There was something profoundly irritating about seeing a young teen sitting under a tree, surrounded by a circle of young females hanging on to his every word. For some strange reason, telepathy just didn't work on him. Most forms of pre- and remote cognition also failed. Why was it then that the boy always gave the impression not of learned tranquility, but a disguised deep gibbering terror?
What are you hiding?
Jam Yang demanded one day.
You should be better than this. Little children are better than this. I've seen you weave through the Mandela sets that befuddle even the ranking seekers. You have the aptitude. I know it.
She paused as the implications disturbed her and her belief system. I just lack the power, is that it? Jam Yang nodded. The psychic intrusion of Javaal said that there was no such thing as the soul. There was nothing eternal and immaterial within man. This was consistent with Buddha's earlier teachings. Everything was relative. There was no fixed reference point of morality that could be used, semantically, as an oppressive point. The Dharma that could be manipulated drew upon a mixture of the human principle and the source of all things, which knows nothing and teaches nothing. The problem therein was that weak psychics could only go so far, but past a certain point, those that could be trained had no real physical limit to what they could accomplish. Only in the mind did it matter. He had the mind, well enough. Why couldn't he do more than barely keep up with the class? His body was frail, but not that frail. Power was a tricky word, instinctively detestable to most Javaalese. Other people don't have to worry about cracking the planet in half, he wanted to say. He forced a slight chuckle. Well, as they say, play to your strengths, or your lack of it. What I need most of all is fine control.
Chee.
She squinted and put her face close to his. What is it? He said, backing away from that intense scrutiny.
You need glasses.
Eh?
For some reason, I think you must have lenses when you say that. Being dishonest without actually directly telling a lie.
Shinji scampered away. He knew something was truly cliché when it reached the collective consciousness of those who had never even watched anime. Days, then weeks, had passed. He had to admit it to himself. He was an amateur. A talented one to be sure, but self-training could only go so far.
For a moment you touched a source of deep primeval power, he was asked. Did it frighten you?
I was barely able to remember who I was and come back. But that seems rather too pat, doesn't it? The reason I can't synchronize with the Ava anymore is because of a mental block? What is it, like a guitar or something?
Perhaps. The best musicians here are those who can best produce a sound without using any instruments at all. We should test that out,
said Feckledraft Circular Sage, another of the odd members of the council. He looked like the recipient of 3 too many lightning strikes. Javaal was in a constant state of evolution, as people from the outside just chanced to find their way in, as expeditions were sent out to find the minds in greatest distress, or greatest minds in distress, or just what they could yank out from the airwaves. As such, it has a sort of mishmash of methodologies and traditions sufficient to be called heretical to practically every other religion in existence. At the same time, the monks called psychotherapy the service they and old ladies had been providing for thousands of years, only now with labels in. Lama Feckledraft was old like most of the monks, whose words actually carried any weight, and contributed daily to the strangeness of the hidden society. In his youth he'd been a field agent. For the moment he attempted to be a reductor, someone who reduced complicated problems into simpler, smaller pieces.
Whether or not we have solved that issue is hard to say, since we so inconveniently lack this Evangelion. Now here's a question. Do you think you are deliberately avoiding turning into your father?
Just because I may have to act like him sometimes doesn't mean I have to be like him. Shinji put his fingers forward into an arch and leaned forward in his seat. And besides, my eyesight's still perfectly fine. For a moment, all the candles around them flickered as if they might go out.
Should we talk about your mother?
I can barely even remember her, Shinji replied. All I can confirm is from recovered reports. Lama Feckledraft tugged at his goatee.
For some reason, I feel it will be important somehow.
He clapped his hands twice.
Very well, let us reduce.
Valor to violence. Joy to apathy. Love to lust. Hope to obsession. With a piece of coloured chalk, he linked the values together.
Negative and positive. Do what is right, deny what is wrong. And yet these things are linked. Anger, no matter how justified, can turn into hatred. Happiness, no matter how great, to have it constantly would be to rob it of its meaning. To love is to have, and sometimes, no matter what, change offers the possibility of things getting better or far worse.
It's chaos, the boy said, twitching.
Such is life. Thus is why Buddha spoke of moderation.
The 8 spokes were then connected into a wheel.
This is not the eightfold path, but see, in like manner do the elves of humanity show to be shades upon each other. The opposite of love is apathy. The parallel of obsession is lust. The act of violence is a release of anger that can even be interpreted as a form of joy. And so on with the figurative nonsense. And yet here, at the centre where they meet, should we put a point? What element connects these emotions?
Is it a fundamental feeling? Like anger?
Perhaps.
The meditation room was a round seclusion with no windows that forced those inside to remain awake, lest they sleep forever from carbon monoxide poisoning. Shinji had to admit it did evoke the right sort of gloomy, portentous atmosphere. Granted, a potentially fatal atmosphere, but he realised that he was trying to delay answering the question. He thought about it. He thought about it some more. The llama made some sort of snort and bobbed his head. The boy's mind reeled with puns. Until finally... Fear, he said. Feckledraft awoke, blinking his eyes quickly. The heavy air lifted immediately.
Explain.
If I may reduce further, teacher. He wrote a little distance away all of the points. Rage, despair, craving, change. Then hesitated over the last point on the far right. 5 to fill the top half, but that would destroy the balance. The hexagon was a beautifully symmetrical figure in itself, provided the centre lines were thought of as dividing lines. 4 still balanced out numerically, but there was something about it that tended to disturb any mind that was aware of aesthetics. There was always that seeming threat to tip the scales, that empty spot at the end. Illogical, but still there. 3 was a fine balance, probably why many ancient numeric systems had base 3. 6, 9, when not using biologically obvious base 2 and 5. 4 was reserved for recollections of a grim yet vaguely distant intent, like Riders of the Apocalypse. 5 was a comparatively harmless, if mystic number. 6 items were often unwieldy to remember, and why am I thinking over this? Breathe. Don't be so smart that you forget you need to be stupid. Breathe. His hand hovered over the 5th spot. It tingled. He shuddered and stepped back. Fear. Fear leads to anger, leads to hate. Fear breeds terror, brings despair. Fear tries to multiply and fade away. It craves the presence of others, lusts for sensations that let it be forgotten for a time. Fear drives change, anything to be other than itself. It is simple, unreasoning, and a constant companion of humanity. So ever-present, in fact, felt by nearly every creature of a mind fine enough to know emotions, that he wondered if a chaos god was even necessary. Taken colloquially, almost everything can be traced to fear. Greatness is the fear of impermanence. Attachment is the fear of loss. Bravery is the denial of fear, or the greater fear of giving in to fear. Ugh. He was not liking that line of reasoning. One could wonder why and how anything ever gets accomplished at all. Here, the negative process can be thought of as flowing upon the river of fear.
What is the opposite of fear?
Courage? No, that's in spite of, not the absence of fear. Perhaps peace? Or a niggling voice added, what is the ultimate peace? Death. Shinji saw the monk had a non-judgmental expression. For some reason, he felt like defending himself anyway. Its own opposite is itself. It's a binary concept. While it has its shades, there's a critical point, either in fear or not. He paused. I've read other writings, and of Enkidu, it might be said that while in savagery and ignorance he feared very little, it was with the knowledge of civilization and other things of value that he realized that he could fear, and only then he could become a protector. The man who would wrestle lions for his flock, and the one prayed for who would be the friend to show a tyrant the error of his ways. The first hero, at least in writing, since the legend of Gilgamesh seems spliced into an earlier myth.
To truly live is to know of fear.
Lama Feckledraft nodded.
To be free of fear is to find serenity. However, there are those who feel that this implies that nothing, therefore, is truly of any value. What about you? Are you afraid?
Well, I can't say I'm fearless, Shinji replied reluctantly. The monk was old enough to need a walking stick, which he took up and with it lightly whacked the boy on the head. He snorted derisively.
There are those who might find your continued resistance to the idea of becoming someone who dictates over a large enough area, like say continents, sound too much like pointless whining. There are those who have it as their life's dream, and for it to be dropped so casually on your lap.
A louder thwack, but upon the stone floor.
Why? What are you afraid of?
The boy hesitated for a long while. Not death, certainly. He had a backup plan which alleviated that somewhat, but overall he saw his own death as merely a cessation. He had no particular belief in an afterlife, for despite all the obvious symbolism, he was raised in the rurals and as such had a default to Shinto. Failure was a more concrete prospect. It wasn't basic enough, though. I'm afraid of myself?
I see at least you have no fear of sounding egotistical.
Shinji shook his head. Sorry, there are hundreds of candles around the room. He focused on just one. Mankind had always feared the dark, but I think the one we feared most was the one we could never run away from, or beat back with fire. The darkness behind the eyes.
Taken in that context, faith lights up the world. There are those who put their faith in reason, doctrine, or in family. Why do you deny, then, those who might have faith in you?
I deny that I'm in any innate way better than anyone. People should obey me when I have legitimate authority that answers to their needs, not just because I can make them obey. He never really considered himself analogous to the God Emperor, which was why others held him in the high esteem severely creeped him out. The taller the pedestal, the greater the fall. At least with, and he used the term with great wariness and in only the most general sort of way, his girls. It was understandable. He found it hard to likewise see them in anything but the best possible light. The mere thought was ridiculous. He was in his first year of junior high. He never really considered himself particularly wise, powerful, or charismatic. He was prepared to grant that, yes, when it comes to tearing things apart with an Evangelion, he was somewhat of an expert. When it comes to either enlightenment or world conquest, he was ready with, hell no, it's not my show. He lacked all the qualifications, knowledge, experience, immortality. He refused to accept the possibility. Man's fate was man's alone to decide. People needed symbols, so inasmuch as Yang helped bring China together, if there was no other choice, Shinji had resigned himself to helping in that way to stabilize a crisis.
Hesitation and denial won't make it any less real. The stakes are higher than ever. Do you really have the time to entertain that sort of idealism?
He was asked in a non-committal tone.
Why do you care what people think?
Because they're real to me, Shinji snarled. This isn't a game. This isn't about winning. Their pain, their fear, they're not meant to be pawns in the game of greater beings. But the only thing I can do is destroy. I've seen it. And it's stupid for man to try and achieve godhood through destruction. A chill wind blew through the room. He gasped for breath. I won't allow it. Because it would be too easy to use the methods of the enemy. Too easy to believe in one's own might and the delusion of inevitable victory. Fear, again, just enough to keep his insight at edge.
Even if it works, how much will you sacrifice just for these principles? You know you may not keep everyone from hurting or dying. What are you, a masochist?
Javaal did not encourage the Jesus complex, for reasons all their own. I don't intend to take responsibility for all humanity, teacher. If it turns out that we humans end up destroying ourselves, that's free will. If there's no choice, I'll act. His voice dropped to a mumble. But I don't need slaves. I don't need worshippers. I don't need to be the absolute right.
Then, what do you want?
Shinji looked at his open right hand. His fingers were twitching uncontrollably. To stop being afraid. He clenched that hand into a fist. As long as I'm alive, those that I can protect, they shall know no fear.
And the rest?
The enemies of humanity will die. By my hands they... The candles all went out. Shinji Ikari slumped back, unconscious. Lama Feckledraft waved and the candles all relit. He sighed. So close that time. What a stubborn boy. He had a real hard-on for humanity. It was obvious to the monks at first sight of him. The boy was obsessed about the welfare of mankind, because he feared that he was losing his own humanity. The boy was coughing as he walked through the outer hall. Lama Feckledraft slapped his back, which unfortunately did not do anything to help. I don't have anything stuck in my throat. Seriously. He leaned against the balustrade and gave a blah at the courtyard. I've heard of people intentionally strangling themselves to help with the mystical mental state. And now, I have to ask, what's wrong with you people? The elder monk laughed.
You do know that you are still, by any definition, insane, right? Perhaps you should not be so quick to criticize.
Well, the voices in my head have reached a consensus that with you, it doesn't matter. He winced as that seemed to amuse the monk even more. What was it about seeing him in obvious discomfort that made otherwise smart and sensible people so happy? Bunch of bloody feckin' squigheads.
Yes, we need to talk about that one of these days.
The voices in my head? Well, I don't precisely want them to go away.
Especially since their presence, for some reason, keeps telepaths from butting in. I would consider it a favour if you could tell me one day what they really say.
Things, Shinji replied in a hollow tone. Disturbing things.
Really? How disturbing.
They walked away. So intent were they in their conversation that they didn't notice a face peering from a corner. It was late afternoon, date uncertain, and there was no particular prohibition against walking. Very slowly, down the outer hallways. Puso and Jamyang had no dislike for each other per se. Javaal was a closed society of psychics, and even then the ratio of those with trainable talents was a handful out of every generation. The students had known each other almost all their lives. Psychic outsiders were rarer still, even though Javaal sent out seekers. It was for that reason that the two agreed to just keep a lookout together when they met each other and their snooping around.
I don't trust him, said Puso, a sensible enough decision. You should not either. He comes out of nowhere, speaking nothing of where he came from, bringing no gifts. Who does he think he is?
Jamyang watched intently as Shinji and Lama Feckledraft continued their discussion.
Someone that even the most honored elders treat as like almost their equal, she whispered. Maybe he is a noble or something outside.
No, that doesn't matter here. This is Javaal. Only one thing matters.
Puso grit his teeth. The newcomer showed no particular honour in the psychic disciplines, nothing that would explain the respect being shown to him. It was undeserved, and while Puso might have been thought of as a junior asshole, his arrogance was born of the clear knowledge that he was the best of his generation.
This is all wrong.
They ducked back as they glimpsed someone arriving down the far corridor. After checking that the passive signs of their presence were still suppressed, they dared to look again. Lama Pagnor, though of apparent African descent, was several generations down of dedicated warrior monks. Feckledraft was an outsider 60 years ago, but had since then proven both might and wisdom. Shinji Ikari had been there for a little less than 5 weeks. They bowed to each other, but only slightly, in the manner of friendly equals. To Jamyang it was a mystery. To Puso it was an insult. The council monks and the boy talked for a while. It was too far for their observers to hear. Jamyang gasped as she saw Shinji snort and rave aside, dismissing something Lama Pagnor said. The severe-looking monk merely laughed.
"He can't do that,"
Puso hissed. He was born into a deeply stratified society, and what would be the point of living and learning for so long, just to become an honoured master and getting a seat on the council, if any brat of an outsider would be allowed to act so flippantly around him? It had always seemed like an immutable law to him. Literally everyone should treat the masters with the greatest deference. Both acolytes in training felt a sudden chill, then realised all 3 of the people at the far end of the hallway were staring in their direction. Shame, fear, and panic hit all at once, and the teens fled. The warrior Lama sniffed.
"Children."
"Well, such is the way of the young and reckless," replied Lama Feckledraft. "No harm done. Let them be."
He turned back to Shinji.
"Now what was it you were saying?"
"Those crystals that you people grow with psychic influence. It's amazing. You had lasers back in the 1500s. I'm not actually all that mechanically inclined, but I think I can figure out a bright lance." He coughed. That was not really important. "I wonder why you don't use it for communication, though."
"Why should we? We already have telepath relays. Much more reliable."
The trio began walking down the corridor, with the boy at the centre. I've been thinking, and really, it isn't. It's true that it's impossible to get caught, but at least with radio you can dial onto a different frequency. With telepaths acting as senders and receivers, they need to keep their focus on one person, or send out a wave that anybody with any ability can pick up. The 2 old masters nodded. There were competitors out in the field. While mental communication couldn't be jammed, it was certainly possible to intercept. Given the rarity of telepaths of that caliber, it seemed a waste just to have them function as a parrot box. Shinji looked thoughtful. And most of all, because it's the human mind doing it, the people involved are directly exposed to any disrupting effects. A psychic wave with the backing of an Evangelion could drive anyone insane. The angels might even be able to detect such intensity of human thoughts. That was one of the disturbing implications he'd recently learned. Humans were not designed to deal with an AT field. Evangelions, built to mimic humans, could however do almost anything that humans were capable of. Those brains were huge and filled with primordial power.
"Lasers for communication would only be that much more complicated,"
Lama Pagnor put in. He too had served as field agent, and while comfortable with technology, had a deep appreciation for simple things that were hard to break. He'd been in more than enough situations rife with collateral damage.
"We minimize electronics here in Javaal. How would that work?"
"I made a proposal for Evangelions to lift battleships to orbit. Why can't 10 people lift something, say, 20 pounds into space? It's not like mass really matters. Shinji shrugged. Then it's just a matter of focusing crystals and mirrors. I've seen you people program molecules. Besides, even if you don't want to make electronics here, I know some people who could produce it for you. He couldn't think of any designs. However, someone somewhere should be able to make it possible. Necessity was the mother of invention, after all. What was the point of all that wealth, gathered illegally or otherwise, if it wasn't used?
What would this serve, though?
Asked Lama Feckledraft.
It might be simpler to just buy a satellite dish from the Chinese black market.
Shinji shook his head. It had also been demonstrated to him that Javaal psychics could pick out mechanical devices. They could store energy inside crystals. Crystals break. Mental networks most of all needed buffers, breakers, markers, and firewalls. Yours are a dangerous people, teacher, Shinji said. Your crystals are von Neumann machines. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, and so on. It might be slow in space since the crystals need to soak up ambient hydrogen, but telepathy doesn't really require a medium. It takes even light hours to cross the solar system. But if there are enough relays to serve as focus for telepaths, we have superliminal, if still in-system, communications. He missed the magi. He didn't even pretend to even understand the Tannhauser field equations. But something itching at the edge of his consciousness told him it was possible. There is no warp here, he had to repeat to himself. Stop dreaming! Lama Feckledraft chuckled.
You really believe it's inevitable that humanity must leave this earth?
Shinji frowned slightly. This world must heal. He could almost feel its anguish. As he had said before, sometimes the best thing to do was nothing at all. He knew his limits. Denying power? Shinji snorted out. What power? How can I refuse what isn't there? It was strange. He was ready to accept his own insanity, yet not delusion. There are practical exercises. Telekinetics were valued since the community in the valley tried to minimize the use of fuel-consuming machinery. How long had it been, really, since he said something about lifting ships into orbit? Now he struggled to keep an egg from breaking. Splotch! Darn, there it goes again. Shinji took a damp cloth and wiped the table. Very carefully he balanced another egg at the tip of his index finger. And let go. Hey, shrimp boy! Splotch! Ugh. It was around noon, the day after, and the students could spend their free hour as they wished. No one paid any more attention to him, what with his demonstration of his pathetic lack of any real power or control. He turned to see Puso Winterglory standing there, sneering. What is it? Shinji responded, as always precisely polite. The other boy sat on the opposite bench of the table. Haven't you mastered that yet? He said, more in disbelief than in discourtesy. Shinji sighed. Briefly, he convinced himself he had 6 arms and picked up 6 eggs. He held the eggs aloft for a moment, then put them down. He looked up and with his right hand picked up an egg. He balanced it on his open palm and showed it to Puso. The egg rose a few millimeters up the palm, then... Splotch! Burst egg yolks splattered all around. Shinji cleaned off his hand and turned away. The silent message was clear enough. 6 was no problem, but holding back the force of his mind to handle just 1 was difficult. I'm not as inept as you think I am, he chose not to say. It was already proven that innate power was inversely proportional to synchronization ability with the Evangelion. No matter how powerful he might be, alone, the Evangelion could magnify that magnitudes greater. He needed to figure out what was keeping him from synchronizing. Little else mattered. Puso Winterglory grinned. You know, maybe we started off on the wrong foot. It doesn't matter what you were outside. You're in Javaal now. Here we are all brothers. He floated an egg and set it spinning. So what do you say? We could be friends, eh? Shinji could have laughed. Puso had such a naturally abrasive personality that when he was trying to be personable, it was eerie. Such overdone friendliness could quickly get through the guard of those often bullied, as it didn't need to be a threat. It was easy up front to just believe in the sudden and uncharacteristic overt kindness. It was also so blatantly transparent. Is he really trying to manipulate me? Shinji's face showed no trace of his amusement within. For all pride in his mental abilities, Puso didn't really know people that well. It's sad. The psychics of PKRU may have been weak in comparison, but at least they knew the reality of suffering. He's not so much a bully as a spoiled brat, born with power, showered respect, raised here in this place of absolute safety. Shinji shook his head. He'd no time to socialise. He wasn't there to teach anyone how to be a better person. I'd most appreciate it if you would just leave me alone. That could only be taken poorly. Puso grimaced and flicked his finger. The floating egg splattered upon Shinji's face.
You're hiding something, he growled. You're pathetic. There's no reason you should be here. You're barely even one of us. You're a spy!
He grabbed Shinji by the folds of the common novice's robe and pulled him up.
I don't know who you are, and I don't care. If you mess with me, I'll make you regret it. Javaal will be mine someday, and no outsider filth is going to stand in my way.
Shinji couldn't take it anymore. He had to laugh, even with goo dribbling down his nose. By the throne, you really do think the world revolves around you, don't you? Puso bared his teeth and lifted a fist, then reconsidered. He was out in the open courtyard after all, and he could feel the stares of the others in the class.
You're not even worth my time.
He spat and shoved at Shinji. He stomped away. Shinji got up and took up the towel to wipe his face. He was still grinning even after he got himself mostly clean. Jam Yang approached, her face weary.
Are you all right?
She asked. I'm fine, Shinji responded cheerily, which only made the psychic girl think he was still trying to repress. She had a much more fine-tuned emotional sense, and even then couldn't feel anything off Shinji.
Are you sure? Not all of us think like him, you know. If you ever need help or just to talk...
No, it's not bother at all. How can one really rule others without first ruling one's own heart? He replied, still chuckling. Only from self-control did other exploits follow. He couldn't get angry over a little thing like that. However, from then on, even those who had gotten somewhat comfortable around him drew back to give true isolation. He was never invited into any groups of discussion or activities outside of the lessons. Teenager students, even in a monastery, especially in a monastery, couldn't afford to have their casual words somehow find their way into the ears of their teachers. The only one who still bothered to interact otherwise was Jam Yang, but even she realised that his trust wouldn't be easily given and his secrets unravelled so quickly. This suited him just fine, as it gave him time to experiment upon the methods he was being taught. The special instruction he got from the masters also passed beneath notice. Being a persona non grata was a rather relaxing feeling, even. He just wished that he could write letters back to Tokyo free. Yet more time passed. Javaal's seekers reported that psychics all over the world were going to ground, as mysterious deaths continued to plague their secret worldwide community. The valley itself had to accept refugees, but none of them were allowed past the outer settlement. There are other enclaves, in Brazil, Canada and Poland, but they were much more vulnerable in comparison. Shinji's studies had to intensify, the quicker to get to and fulfill the bargain he and the council had agreed upon back during their first meeting. Students in the advanced class are each under the instruction of a ranking acolyte, as a master to an apprentice. He had Hasya Cheerful Garden Song, which was yet another point of ridicule. Of course he would be a disappointment in class. What could he possibly learn from that weird woman? Her foray into existentialism could only go as far as,
What is reality? It is whatever's popular at the moment.
She was strange and sometimes irritating, but people tended to forget that her own personal teacher during her younger years was the chief abbot himself, which might explain a lot of weirdness.
I've never really gone for this whole serenity thing, actually,
she said.
Sit down and what, you just get a cramp. If someone wants to go to sleep, then she might as well be comfortable. Right, Satava?
The chief abbot was old enough and respected enough that he could just plop down and pretend meditation sleeping. That way he could say without lying that the source of his wisdom was constant meditation. So, how do you get in touch with your inner self then? Fortunately, Shinji's peanut gallery was silent. Hasya had never apparently realised that her teacher was the chief abbot himself, or that she was the most dangerous psychic in all Javaal. Grand Lamas were supposed to be built of gravitas or something, not little old men that behaved as if the world was their own private little joke.
This way,
she said jovially, much more comfortable now that she didn't have to deal with the immense pressure of being outside. She made a hopping half dance that the teen reluctantly followed.
Now, Uttamata Vrush. Uttamata vrush!
Hassia waved her hands up in the air and kicked out lightly. Shinji did the same with much less enthusiasm.
Uttamata vrush! Get that toadfish out of there!
What? Hassia just kept on dancing and chanting. Watching the delight in that face, lost in the memories, Shinji wondered just why was it that she was so frightened of being outside. She seemed younger and much happier inside, and he decided he didn't really need to know. He chuckled. He felt at peace, crossing past embarrassment that he would not care anymore how it looked. Perhaps it did work after all. It was April 14th, 2016, and there were plenty of reasons to rejoice. The people may not know it, but they had already beat back prophesied Armageddon by a full year. There was a tech festival in Tokyo 3. People from all over the country had arrived to go ooh over the city's attractions, such as A. The black stone walls of the fortress city Tokyo 3, made of pure AT field pressed granite, 5 meters thick and 20 meters tall. Thick plates of metal and ceramic were then inserted into prepared spaces. Most older residents considered it an eyesore, obscuring what had been a lovely vista of rolling hills and lush forests. However, it secured the northeastern section of the city from attack, and the propaganda posters went so far as to present it as an Ava-scale barricade. B. The tunnel carved out by Ava 1 and 2 through a mountain, the largest man-made straight, if rather short, hollow in the world. It also had a reinforced concrete highway that directly linked Trident Base to Tokyo 3 downtown. C. The NERV Visitors Centre, as all non-authorised access was still kept well out of the geofront. There were scale models of the Evangelions, pilot profiles, books, toys and assorted merchandise. The Whack-A-Gendo game was unsurprisingly popular. D. Trident Base was a lot more receptive to oglers of their great machine. It was easier to make a publicly available Trident Land Dreadnought game simulator. A columnist somewhere had commented, "If we must all foolishly hope, then the Tancred is Sancho Panza to Icari's Eternus, and we are all better of that is that way." E. The in-construction Lake Ashino positron lance cannon. Environmentalists were worried about the effect of using the lake as a heat dump, but not as much as the environmental effects of angels rampaging all over the place. The highlight of the festival, however, was the local go-kart derby. It was just a race of safety-first light cars intended for children. The main street was cleared for that event, and the course would go down the straightaway, loop around 2nd Avenue, then back to the start, 4 kilometres in total with 4 laps. It was impossible to separate partisan interest from that many people. Toji Suzahara found himself feebly trying to keep under control possibly the cutest, most cheerful bunch of future anarchists he had ever seen. Not that he'd seen a lot of such, for comparison, but there were a lot of boys and Gretch all gathered together. Their parents were at the verge of coming to blows. Settle down, you runts, he shouted into the megaphone. Little drivers, get to your vehicles. Little mechanics, step away from your competitors' vehicles. Shut the hell up, you little lunatics!
Is he allowed to talk to my children that way?
An irate parent complained to a nearby police officer.
That does it!
A yell sounded from behind them.
Get him!
Ah! Toji yelled as he was dogpiled. Little kids and ankle biters. Once on the ground, he was all but done for. He flailed about, but was pinned down by the sheer weight of numbers. Are your children allowed to swarm him like that? The officer asked. The parent turned to see the children only dispersing at the command of their own leader figures.
I don't know.
You know, why don't you grown-ups move aside, and do your discussions over there? Let the kids have the street. It was not a request. As quickly as the children formed into one screaming mob, so did they again fracture into bickering groups centered around their respective vehicles. Post-Impact Japan had rules about corporations trying to commandeer public events, that is to say, very little. Sponsors skirted the regulations that carts had to be mostly home-built and must be built with safety first in mind. What with the restriction on weight, speed and construction, most carts looked like miniature drag races or wingless plane fuselages. The boys' carts were instantly recognisable from the others out of town. Other carts had clean aerodynamic lines. They had proudly built their own, needing no sponsorship. Their parents' bountiful enthusiasm could only be hopefully matched by their wallets or engineering experience. The race officials had certified the carts. Yes, they were safe, even if they looked like they might fall apart at any moment. Streamlining? What's that? The boys' carts were 60 to 80% engine, stubby, angular, eye-hurtingly painted pieces of bolted-on machinery. The boys' clubs worked best when they were ingratiated to the community, hiding their secrets in plain sight. Whatever misgivings parents had, it was true that grades were improving and bullying was starting to fade as a problem. It was great to see young kids practicing democracy, even if it was mostly mob rule. Now if only they could be convinced to stop talking in a gutter-sink dialect.
Weight runs go faster, everyone knows that,
shouted the driver of the Wobble Sons Club. There was no particular reason their cart had to look like a Model T.
Blue ones are yucky,
retorted the one from the Good Boy Moons Club.
If this was just a straight line race maybe, but we got the skills. We practice.
She was sitting on the fender of her vehicle, angled into a sharp triangular ram.
Ah! Stranger, you done got the best bits, you blinds. Don't you see this yellow paint?
Such words from the Goldie Toothy Club were punctuated by the sound of its crew walking into each other and various things that would go clang, bonk, or any variation thereof. Everyone was wearing thick goggles to show their kin spirits with the driver, since apparently a windshield was not part of the best bits they collected, and likewise, not important, was peripheral vision. The boys crowded around an impassive Ray and an increasingly frazzled Oscar, asking for their favour for the race, in much the same way a knight of old might have asked for a lady's blessing. A slightly bruised Toji went over to the sidewalk and sat there. He grinned a bit, watching them. His sister was driving. At first he'd been nervous, for her safety and how her leukemia might affect things. Eventually all three Suzuhara males had to allow it. She needed a reason to live, to enjoy life, more than days of endless observation at the hospital. Hikari arrived with a bottle of chilled water and a wash towel. She gave both to him and asked,
"Feeling okay?"
"Yeah. It's hot though." He splashed water onto the towel and pressed it to his face. He exulted in the comforting coolness. "How about you? Where are your sisters?" Hikari shrugged.
"Kodama has to be around here somewhere. Nozomi's over there with the rest of the boys."
It was hard to pick out the little girl from the throng, but she was keeping the other children just barely under control as they pleaded their case before the pilots. Hikari chuckled as Asuka let out loud, "What the hell?" from some remark that Ray must have said, followed by, "What the hell?" again. Toji laughed too. "She still hasn't figured it out, has she? She's the perfect Tsukomi, even if her personality doesn't really seem to fit at first glance."
"It's my fault,"
Hikari replied, shaking her head slowly.
"I may have looked so reluctant to answer that she was reminded of how I acted when she asked me before about what yaoi means. So now she's convinced it's something really deviant and refuses to even be told what it really is."
"Yeah. On second thoughts, I don't really need to know where she picked that up." A few moments later, the loudspeakers announced the event would begin in just 5 more minutes. In the end, with Ray favouring the Moon Club and Asuka the Sun Club, the tiebreaker went to the Teeth Club. They needed it most. It was a celebration of childhood and innocence and joy and peace and hope and crass commercialism. The races were set, the road was clear, and they were all just counting down the seconds. Then the speakers sounded again, but this time in alarm. "Hostile alert! Hostile alert! Please proceed to the nearest shelter calmly, quickly, and in order. There is no need to panic. Please proceed to the nearest shelter. Please give priority to NERV personnel during this time. Repeat. Hostile alert. Please proceed to the nearest..." The visitors had gone to Tokyo 3 looking for that visceral thrill of being near a danger zone. However, now that it was all too real, they were starting to panic. The Tokyo 3 residents, however, took it all in stride and helped to calm down the nearest out-of-towner. Shops were closed up quickly. Policemen began herding people. The Ava pilots were already being shuffled away by NERV Section 2. The announcer for the race added in his apologies that the race must stop. "All right, women and children first," Toji shouted into his megaphone. He had the sash of a volunteer organizer and an expression that would tolerate no crowd stupidity. "Take only your most important items, leave the rest. Move it, people, this race isn't going anywhere."
"What?"
Mari Suzuhara shouted.
"Shut that!"
She gunned the engine and sent her cart roaring down the avenue. The rest of the boys' carts followed quickly and without hesitation. "Shit!" was Toji's amplified shout.
Ah, damn brats!
He began running down the street to follow, and as he passed the announcer's booth, said to them,
Give her a 3-second penalty!
Shizahara!
Hikari shouted. She rubbed at her temples.
Shizahara!
She cast her gaze around, then caught sight of an ice cream vendor in his minifan.
You!
She shouted into a megaphone.
Sir, I will have to ask for your cooperation in retrieving some idiots!
The man was a seasoned Tokyo Free citizen. He merely grinned and bowed to say she was welcome to commandeer his vehicle. What's an angel attack or two? Visitors were convinced that all in Tokyo Free were each their own way insane. Iruo dropped straight down, right out of high orbit. Back in the Himalayas, Shinji danced on, unknowing. Utamata o yach! And now he knew.